John had always loved the quiet charm of Willow Creek Estates, the small semi-rural neighborhood where sprawling lots met patchy woodlands, and old dirt roads wound past weathered barns and modest homes. For years, his barn had stood quietly at the edge of his property, a place where he cared for his two sturdy bulls, Duke and Samson. It was his sanctuary, a refuge from the fast pace of the world. But that evening, something felt off. John sat at his kitchen table under the harsh light of a single bulb, holding a letter that made his stomach twist. The envelope was embossed with the HOA's official seal. The bold formal typeface inside left no room for confusion. Immediate violation notice. Unauthorized structure. The letter claimed his barn was non-compliant with HOA regulations and demanded he cease all use immediately or face severe fines. There was a deadline, a week. John's jaw clenched. The HOA had never sent a letter like this before. For years, they turned a blind eye to the barn. Now, out of nowhere, they wanted it gone. He thought back to the last HOA meeting. Karen Reynolds, the HOA president, had seemed more aggressive than usual. Her voice had cut through the room like ice, promising a new era of strict enforcement. John had tried to speak up, defending his barn, but Karen had dismissed him with a sharp look and a warning to comply or face consequences. There was something cold and unyielding behind her glare, an edge John hadn't seen before. That night, as John turned off the porch light and locked the front door, a low breeze stirred the trees, casting long shadows across the property. He walked toward the barn, a habit he had done countless times. The moon was a thin crescent, barely lighting the path. Halfway there, a faint rustling stopped him. His breath caught. He squinted into the darkness. Was that a shadow moving near? The barn. He froze, every muscle tense. Then silence. John shook his head, trying to shake off the creeping unease. Maybe it was just a stray animal or the wind. But as he reached the barn door, he saw it. The door latch, slightly unlatched, swinging in the breeze. A cold spike of fear hit his chest. He always secured the barn carefully. Someone had been there. Someone had been inside. The bulls, Duke, and Samson were inside, their low grumbles vibrating through the barn's wooden frame. John pushed the door open cautiously, heart hammering. The bulls turned their massive heads toward him, nostrils flaring, muscles tense. They sensed his tension. He ran his hand along the hay bales, checking for any signs of disturbance. Broken, ropes, spilled feed. Everything looked normal, but that unlocked door gnawed at him. Had Karen already begun her inspection without telling him? As he stepped outside again, the night air felt heavier. Something unseen was watching. Back inside the house, John sat by the window, staring at the barn in the distance. A dozen thoughts raced through his mind. Was this just the beginning of a campaign to take away his property? Why was Karen so obsessed with the barn now? Was it personal? Or something more? Suddenly his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number flashed on the screen. Watch your back. Not everyone in the HOA is on Karen's side. Stay alert. John's fingers trembled. Was this a warning or a threat? The peaceful life he cherished felt like it was unraveling, thread by thread, and deep down, John knew the real storm was only just beginning. The next morning, the sunlight poured through the windows, but John felt no relief. The letter, the unlocked barn door, and the cryptic text gnawed at his mind like a relentless itch he couldn't scratch. He tried to focus on routine chores, but every creak outside made him flinch. Determined to understand what was happening, John decided to inspect the grounds around the barn more carefully. As he stepped outside, The cold morning air bit at his skin. The dew glistened on the grass, but something else caught his eye. A trail of muddy footprints leading up to the barn door. His heart sank. Whoever had been here before wasn't just a random intruder. It was deliberate. Someone had come looking for trouble. John followed the footprints, noting the size, larger than his own boots, and the direction, away from the barn, leading towards the woods bordering his property. He wondered if they belonged to Karen, or maybe one of her allies. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from a neighbor, a man named Greg, who lived a few houses down. Greg, saw Karen lurking near your place last night. She was taking notes, snapping photos. Something's definitely brewing. John frowned. If Karen was already investigating his barn, under cover of night, things were escalating faster than he'd imagined. Later that day, John went to the HOA meeting, held in the community clubhouse. The atmosphere was thick with tension. As he entered, all eyes seemed to fall on him. Whispers followed like shadows. Karen was there, sitting at the head of the table, her posture rigid, eyes cold as steel. When their gazes met, she gave a thin, satisfied smile. John's blood boiled, but he forced himself to remain calm. The meeting began with the usual mundane topics: landscaping rules, parking regulations. But it didn't take long for Karen to shift focus. She stood, clearing her throat loudly. "We're here to address growing concerns about unauthorized structures," Karen announced, voice clipped and controlled. "Some residents have ignored repeated warnings, threatening the integrity of our community's standards." Her words were a clear jab at John. He raised his hand. "My barn has been here for over 10 years. It's always complied with the regulations. Until now, what's changed?" Karen's eyes flashed. "Nothing changes unless violations occur, and investigations prove it's necessary." A hush fell over the room. Some neighbors nodded along. Others looked uneasy. Then, a man, clearly on Karen's side, spoke up. "Rules are rules, John. We all agreed to them when we moved here." John felt isolated, but also a spark of defiance. He knew many neighbors felt Karen's approach was heavy-handed, even cruel, but fear kept them silent. After the meeting, John stepped outside. The afternoon sun felt warm, but the chill of suspicion lingered. He noticed a shadow moving just beyond the tree line near his property. His pulse quickened. Was someone watching? Or waiting, back at home? The bulls paced in the barn, restless and uneasy. John's mind raced. The barn was more than just a structure. It was his connection to peace, stability, and freedom. Karen's push to control it felt like a personal attack. That night, as John prepared for bed, his phone vibrated again. Another anonymous message appeared. "Trust no one. Karen's not working alone. There's more at stake than you realize." John stared at the screen, his mind a whirlwind of questions. Who else could be involved? And what was the true reason behind the HOA's sudden aggression? Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees and whispering secrets John wasn't ready to hear. The night settled heavy and dark over Willow Creek Estates. John's house was cloaked in shadows. The only sound, the soft creak of the old floorboards beneath his feet. Sleep eluded him. His mind replayed the day's events, the footprints, Karen's icy glare, the chilling messages that whispered of secrets he wasn't privy to. At exactly midnight, a sudden noise shattered the silence. A faint creak from the direction of the barn. John's breath hitched. He grabbed the flashlight. He kept by the door and slipped silently outside, careful not to alert Duke or Samson. The moon was thin, casting a ghostly glow over the fields, but the barn was swallowed in darkness. Approaching the barn, John's flashlight caught movement. A figure crouched near the door, fumbling with the lock. Karen. She didn't notice John watching. Her face was hard, her eyes fixed and determined. She muttered under her breath, "This is for the good of the neighborhood." Her fingers worked expertly, forcing the latch open. John's heart thundered in his chest. He should shout, "Call the police! Stop her!" But the look in her eyes froze. Him. This was no simple inspection. This was a raid. The barn door swung open. John's bulls inside stirred instantly. Low growls rumbling through the wooden walls. He could hear Karen's cautious footsteps as she stepped inside, flashlight beams scanning every corner. John swallowed hard. Hiding behind a nearby tree, he felt the weight of the moment crushing him. Should he intervene or wait for the authorities? Suddenly, a loud snort echoed from the barn, and Duke pawed the ground aggressively. Karen froze, her breath catching. The bulls, sensing an intruder, began to shift uneasily, their grunts growing louder. Outside, John's phone vibrated. He risked a glance. Another anonymous text flashed. "Don't provoke her. Let the bulls do their work." His blood ran cold. Karen, seemingly undeterred, stepped deeper into the barn. John's hands clenched into fists, torn between protecting his property and avoiding a dangerous confrontation. Then came a sudden crash. Karen stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering wildly. The bulls had moved closer, their massive bodies blocking her path. Outside, the tension was electric. John's neighbors, stirred by the noise, peeked cautiously from their windows, whispering among themselves. Karen's voice rose in panic. "Get them away! Get them away!" But the bulls stood firm, eyes blazing in the dim light. Their warning, clear and unmistakable. John, finally breaking from his hiding spot, shouted, "Karen, get out! You're trespassing!" But Karen's stubbornness wouldn't let her retreat. She fumbled for her phone, likely to call for backup, or perhaps to report John. John knew the standoff could spiral into violence at any moment. His heart hammered as he weighed his options. He wanted to protect his bulls, his home, and his sanity. But how? Suddenly, the sound of approaching vehicles pierced the night. The unmistakable wail of police sirens. John exhaled sharply. The authorities were coming. Karen, caught between the bulls and the arriving police, glared fiercely at John, but a flicker of fear crossed her face. The barn's shadows grew long as the police cars pulled up. Flashlights pierced the darkness, officers stepping out, ready to assess the chaotic scene. John stepped forward, relief flooding him. But the question lingered. What would the authorities decide? And what price would Karen pay for her reckless intrusion? The barn stood cloaked in darkness, save for the flickering beams of police flashlights cutting through the night. Inside, Duke and Samson, massive bulls bred for strength and temperament, stared down the intruder, muscles coiled and ready. Their heavy breaths steamed in the cool air, a low guttural growl vibrating through the wooden walls. The tension was palpable. John watched from the barn's entrance, every nerve screaming. He knew his bulls were territorial, protective, and unpredictable when threatened. They weren't just animals, they were his guardians. And now, those guardians faced the woman who had crossed the line, invading his sanctuary in defiance of law and reason. The officers moved cautiously. One stepped forward and called out, "Ma'am, step away from the bulls. You're trespassing." Karen's jaw tightened. "This barn violates HOA rules." She snapped back, her voice sharp, despite the bull's menacing presence. "I have every right to be here." John's heart pounded. No matter the rules, breaking in was illegal. The officers exchanged glances, their hands resting near their belts. ready for anything. Duke shifted, pawing the dirt, nostrils flaring as if sensing the growing danger. Samson snorted loudly, stepping forward and lowering his massive head. The sheer power radiating from the two bulls was intimidating, even to the police. John raised his voice, steady but urgent. "Karen, leave now, before someone gets hurt." Karen's eyes flicked to the bulls, then back to John. She hesitated, but pride kept her rooted. She pulled out her phone and began dialing. Suddenly, Duke let out a fierce bellow, the sound echoing through the neighborhood like a warning horn. The bulls moved as one, closing ranks and making their presence undeniable. The officers took a step back, clearly unsettled. One whispered into his radio, requesting backup and animal control. Karen's face paled, but her voice remained defiant. "I'm just doing my job." John's gaze hardened. "Your job isn't worth risking lives. You crossed a line." A neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, appeared at the edge of the crowd that had gathered quietly along the street. Her eyes were wide with worry. "John, call the authorities. Let them handle this." John nodded, already dialing the sheriff's office. He kept one eye on Karen, the other on his bulls. Every second felt like a countdown to disaster. The minutes dragged, tension thick as fog. Karen's phone call ended abruptly, and she lowered her device, looking around wildly. Suddenly, from the shadows of the crowd, a tall figure emerged. Greg, the neighbor who had warned John days before. Greg pushed through the gathering, his calm demeanor cutting through the chaos. "Let's keep this peaceful," he said firmly. "The bulls are agitated. We don't want anyone hurt." Karen shot him a glare but said nothing. John felt a flicker of hope. Maybe reason could still prevail. Then, flashing lights appeared down the road. More police, and importantly, animal control officers. The sound of the trucks rolling in brought a palpable shift in energy. The bulls quieted slightly, their sharp, alertness easing with the presence of professionals. One officer approached John, speaking softly. "We'll handle this from here. You did the right thing waiting." John exhaled deeply, the tight coil of adrenaline in his chest beginning to unwind. Still, his eyes lingered on Karen, who stood isolated, her authority crumbling beneath the weight of her own recklessness. As animal control officers began setting up barriers to safely guide Duke and Samson back into their stalls, John realized this was far from over. The fight for his barn and his peace had only just begun. The flashing police lights bathed the quiet neighborhood street in harsh blues and reds, casting long flickering shadows over the small crowd that had gathered. John stood beside his barn, heart still pounding from the night's chaotic confrontation. The bulls, now corralled by animal control, shifted uneasily in their stalls, nostrils flaring but restrained. Despite the calm settling in the barn, tension outside was far from over. Karen Reynolds stood apart, her arms crossed like a fortress, eyes cold and unyielding. Though surrounded by officers, she radiated an almost imperious defiance that unsettled John more than any direct threat ever had. She wasn't just here for a barn. She was on a mission, and she wasn't going to back down easily. John's gaze swept over the gathering neighbors. Many avoided looking at him. Some exchanged uneasy whispers, and a few gave him subtle nods of support. The community felt divided, fractured by Karen's relentless crusade against his barn, and perhaps against anything she deemed non-compliant. One of the police officers, a tall woman named Officer Diaz, approached John quietly. "We're here to keep the peace, but if things escalate, we'll have to act." John nodded grimly. "I just want this nightmare to end." Karen suddenly broke the silence. stepping forward. Her voice was loud and sharp, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. You all see what happens when people ignore the rules. This barn isn't just a structure. It's a threat to our property values and neighborhood safety. If it goes unchecked, what's next? Her words hit like a slap. Some neighbors murmured in agreement, while others looked down, uncomfortable. With her tone, John stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. The barn has been here for years. My bulls are well cared for and secured. This is my home, my livelihood. It's not a threat. It's part of who I am. Karen sneered. You're stubborn and reckless. You think you're above the law. Before John could respond, Karen's phone buzzed. She glanced down and then, to everyone's shock, began speaking quietly but urgently into the receiver. The crowd hushed instantly. John strained to hear the conversation, catching only fragments. Escalate. Legal action. Immediate removal. Something about her words didn't sit right. Suddenly, Karen glanced up and locked eyes with John. This isn't just about a barn. There are bigger plans for this neighborhood. You're standing in the way. The warning sent a chill down John's spine. What could be more important than a barn? What plans were being hidden beneath Karen's polished facade? Then from the crowd, a voice called out, "Who else is involved, Karen? What are you hiding?" Murmurs rippled through the neighbors. The tension thickened, suspicion growing like wildfire. Officer Diaz stepped in. Let's keep this civil. If there are questions, they'll be answered through proper channels. But Karen was already turning away, eyes blazing with determination. She didn't need the crowd's approval. She had a plan, and John was the obstacle. John felt the weight of the moment. He wasn't just defending his barn anymore. He was fighting for his home, his dignity, and the truth. As Karen walked toward her car, John caught a final glance from her, one filled with quiet menace. The standoff wasn't over. It was only beginning. The next morning dawned heavy with uncertainty. John woke early, the uneasy feeling from the night still pressing on his chest like a weight. The barn stood quiet, the bulls calm but alert. Outside, the neighborhood seemed to buzz with whispers and stolen glances, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. John knew one thing for sure. Karen's words from the night before were more than just bluster. There was something bigger at play. A hidden agenda that reached far beyond the barn and even the HOA rules. Determined to get answers, John reached out to Greg, the neighbor who had warned him days earlier. They agreed to meet discreetly at a local cafe, away from prying eyes and ears. Greg arrived looking grim. "John, you're right to be worried. Karen isn't acting alone. There's a faction within the HOA pushing for redevelopment, a plan to sell off properties, rezone the area, and bring in commercial development. Your barn is just the first target." John's eyes widened. "Why? This place has been peaceful for years. Who would want to tear it up?" Greg leaned in, voice dropping. "Money, big money. Developers have been courting some members of the board for months. Karen's the front woman. Her strict enforcement is a way to clear out anyone who resists." John felt a cold fury rising. "So they're trying to force me out, make me an example." Greg nodded. "Exactly. They want to break the community spirit." John's mind raced. If Karen and her allies succeeded, the neighborhood's quiet charm would be lost forever, replaced by soulless shops and condos. But there was more. Greg pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, a copy of a confidential HOA meeting agenda that had mysteriously landed in his mailbox. It detailed plans for rezoning the area, pushing through a vote in just weeks. "This is their secret playbook," Greg whispered. "If it gets out, people will revolt." But Karen's silence and intimidation keep most afraid to speak, John clenched his fists. The battle was no longer just about a barn. It was about preserving their way of life, returning home. John paced the floor, the bulls watching him with calm, steady eyes. Suddenly, a loud knock rattled the front door. His heart skipped. At the door stood Officer Diaz, her expression serious, but kind. "John, I wanted to warn you. There's been an anonymous tip that someone might try to sabotage your property. Vandalism, maybe worse. We're increasing patrols." John's jaw tightened. The stakes were escalating dangerously. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed again. Another anonymous message. "They're watching. Trust no one. Stay ready." John's blood ran cold. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of distant engines. Vehicles moving through the neighborhood. A shadow shifting just beyond the tree line. He glanced toward the barn, where Duke and Sampson stood silently, like sentinels guarding not just a structure, but the last stand against forces threatening to uproot everything John held dear. John realized this fight was bigger than him, but he wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever. Night had fallen again over Willow Creek Estates, but this time the darkness felt different, thicker, heavier, almost suffocating. John sat on his porch, the bulls resting in the barn, but never far from his mind. Every creak, every rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge. The warnings, the threats, the shadowy figures lurking. Something was coming. His phone buzzed once more, an unknown number lighting up the screen. Hesitating, John answered. A distorted voice whispered, "Tonight, they move. Be ready." Before John could ask who they were, the line went dead. Suddenly, headlights pierced the night. A convoy of trucks and SUVs rolled slowly down the street, their engines rumbling like thunder. John recognized the vehicles. Some were unmarked. Others bore official-looking decals. He grabbed his flashlight and rushed toward the barn, heart hammering. From the shadows, figures emerged, moving quickly, confidently. It was an orchestrated raid. Karen led the group, her expression icy and triumphant. "This is the final warning, John," she called out, voice carrying through the cold air. "Remove the barn or face legal consequences." John stood firm, blocking their path. "You don't have the right to do this." Karen smirked. "Watch me." Without warning, one of the men stepped forward with a clipboard, brandishing what looked like a court order. But John's eyes narrowed. It was poorly printed, suspiciously vague. The confrontation was about to turn ugly. Suddenly a loud bellow shattered the tension. Duke and Sampson, sensing the threat, charged out of the barn with terrifying force. The ground shook under their weight. The crowd scattered. Officers scrambling to control the situation. Chaos erupted. Karen screamed orders, but the bulls were unstoppable. The men retreated, some stumbling over the rough terrain. John grabbed his phone, dialing 911 frantically. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. As the first responders arrived, the scene shifted. Officers separated the parties, trying to restore order. Karen was pulled aside, fuming and frustrated. John approached Officer Diaz, breathless. "That wasn't legal. Those papers, they're fake." Diaz frowned. "We'll investigate. But the bulls saved you tonight." Neighbors, long silent, began emerging from their homes, whispering about the drama unfolding on their once peaceful street. But John knew this was far from over. The fight for his barn and his life had reached its climax, and the next moves would decide everything. Just as the night seemed to settle, John's phone vibrated again. A message lit the screen. "Not everything is as it seems. Watch your back." Trust no one. John's blood ran cold. The real enemy was still in the shadows. The sun rose slowly over Willow Creek Estates, casting a soft golden light on the quiet street. After the chaos of the midnight raid, the neighborhood seemed almost peaceful, but beneath the calm, tension simmered. John stood outside his barn, watching Duke and Samson graze calmly. The bulls were back where they belonged, but the battle over his home was far from finished. The morning brought news. The police confirmed the court order presented during the raid was a forgery. Karen and her shadowy allies were under investigation for fraud and intimidation. But the victory felt hollow. Karen's parting words echoed in John's mind. Not everything is as it seems. Determined to uncover the full truth, John began digging deeper into the HOA's records, secretly meeting with neighbors who had quietly expressed doubts but feared speaking out. What he discovered shocked him. A web of corruption, entwining some HOA board members with powerful developers. Plans to transform the entire neighborhood into a commercial zone, displacing families and erasing the community's history, had been underway for months. Karen was just a pawn, albeit a ruthless one, sent to pressure and frighten anyone standing in the way. But the deeper John dug, the more dangerous it became. Anonymous threats escalated. Strange cars were spotted lurking near his property. One evening, as John locked up the barn, he found an envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a photo, not of him or the bulls, but of Greg, the trusted neighbor who had warned him weeks ago. Attached was a note. Some allies wear masks. Be careful who you trust. John's world twisted again. Had Greg been playing a double game? Was the corruption deeper than he thought? He stood there, heart pounding, staring into the gathering dusk. The battle for Willow Creek Estates was not just about land or barns. It was about trust, power, and survival. John looked toward the barn where Duke and Samson stood, silent and strong. With them by his side, he felt ready for whatever came next. Because in a world where neighbors could turn enemies, and the rules were just illusions, sometimes the only defense was strength, and the courage to fight. As he pocketed the photo and locked the door, John whispered to himself, "This isn't over, not by a long shot."